Good afternoon. On behalf of Authors at Google, it was my privilege to welcome philosopher and author Rebecca Newberger Goldstein to Mountain View 4 years ago. She's back. I think she enjoyed her visit. Ms. Goldstein was trained as a philosopher of science, receiving her PhD from Princeton University, and is the author of 10 prize-winning books of both fiction and nonfiction. She has received fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, Guggenheim Foundations, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Radcliffe Institute, among others. Since her last visit, she has been named Humanist of the Year, as well as Free Thought Heroine. In her latest book, Ms. Goldstein asks us to accept the one preposterous premise that Plato could turn up in 21st century America, an author on a book tour. So here he is at Google headquarters in Mountain View, California, discussing with his media escort and a software engineer whether crowdsourcing can answer all ethical questions. So here we are at Google headquarters in Mountain View, California, where Ms. Goldstein will discuss her latest book, Plato at the Googleplex. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Newberger Goldstein.
Hi, it's very good to be here. Obviously, I was fairly inspired 4 years ago when I visited this place. And so in bringing Plato back, I brought him here first to Google. That solved many practical problems for me. I didn't want to have to waste a lot of time bringing him up to speed about everything that's happened in the past 2,400 years. So he gets himself a Chromebook here, and he gets addicted very, very quickly to the internet. And by the last chapter, when he's in discussion with a neuroscientist and he's about to have his brain imaged, he knows quite a bit of neuroscience. He's taken a MOOC, and so he can translate an ancient argument that he put forth in the Phaedo, a kind of non-reductive argument that is there in the Phaedo in one of his dialogues. He can translate it into neuroscientific terms, and it's all thanks to the first stop here at Google. He was very, very intrigued by what was going on here, particularly intrigued by the whole notion of the cloud, as he would be. But this is an odd book, to say the least. It's divided up into two parts. There are 10 chapters, and 5 of them are expository, and they go back in time to the ancient Greeks. And what was it? Well, it's a problem I and many others have tried to solve for the past 2 millennia. I think I solve it. As to why the ancient Greeks did so much, right? They not only discovered philosophy, but in a sense, began science, proto-science, certainly introduced the study of abstract mathematics. Geometry existed in other places, certainly in Egypt, but the notion of proof, of axioms, of deduction, this really was discovered by the ancient Greeks. What else did they do? I mentioned philosophy. Democracy, right? They discovered democracy, not quite our form of democracy. In fact, the founders, the writers of the American Constitution, who were all classically trained and knew their Plato, in some sense formed our form of democracy, knowing Plato's criticisms of Athenian democracy. What else did they do? Well, there's art, right? Art, architecture, timeless poetry, tragedies, comedies. It's still studied and still move us. So this is an extraordinary people. And I'm particularly interested in that they discovered this kind of peculiar question, the philosophical question, that it is my contention still exists and is still very alive in our society. But it's even more amazing that they did what they did because they did it so quickly. They went from anime and illiteracy to Aeschylus and Aristotle in a matter of 200 years. It had been an illiterate society. There had been literacy under the Mycenaean culture, then it was destroyed. They imported the alphabet from the Phoenicians, adapted it to their language, and then there's just this explosion of achievement. And what was it that allowed that to happen? I actually have an article in the New York Times today under The Stone, which is where philosophers philosophize, and it's a blog, and it's about the way in which our society is so very similar to ancient Greek society. And it's very similar in ways in which Socrates and Plato had actually criticized their society. But there are many ways we're living in a time that makes us particularly able to appreciate the value system of the ancient Greeks and what allowed them to achieve so much. So that's part of what I'm doing, because I do think that there are such interesting parallels between our extraordinary age and their extraordinary age, and some of the same conditions in place that are promoting explosive discoveries. There's that, but then I actually wanted to bring Plato forward into our time and have him discourse with us. Plato, had used the dialogue form, and for very good reason. He actually said that he mistrusted writing. He thought that philosophy is supposed to be a lived discourse, a lived conversation. If you wrote down anything, there was the danger that it would become doctrine. It would become hardened. You would have disciples. Thinking would become thoughtless. It would be a matter of interpreting what the great man has said, and that is the exact opposite of what you want in philosophy, and I think that that's certainly true. So he chose this form, the dialogue form, and he used a beloved figure, Socrates, who was already dead at the time that Plato was writing, and to sort of bring Socrates forward with him as he developed philosophy. And Plato really did give us philosophy as it exists, carved out the landscape. It's as if he almost raised up, like the continent of Atlantis, the whole submerged field of philosophy in all its different sub-branches. And that's actually a very good metaphor to use, because our earliest allusion to the myth of Atlantis comes from Plato in the Timaeus. So that actually comes from him. Anyway, he used Socrates in these dialogues and probed his own society. And I thought, well, why not do the same for Plato, to bring him forward into our day, to put him into dialogues with our society. And as many times as I could, which turned out to be quite often, to lift actual passages from his dialogues into contemporary dialogues as seamlessly as possible, so that my readers wouldn't know that this actually came from a 2,400-year-old man. And every time I say that, I think of the Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, 2,000-year-old man skit that probably most of you are too young to remember, but it's extremely funny, right? You should Google it. And to seamlessly fit these passages into our own dialogues, to show that there's a kind of relevance still of this man. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. In many ways, we've left him in the dust. which I believe he would have wanted. If, in fact, there is any philosophical progress made at all, and I actually try to argue that there is in this book, then Plato can't be completely relevant. His answers can't be completely right. Plato himself was committed to the possibility of making philosophical progress. That is certainly the most obvious interpretation of the most famous passage of his writings, The Myth of the Cave. You start in darkness, staring at the shadows at the back cave, the back wall of the cave, and then you're let out into reality. He certainly was committed to our making philosophical progress. If Plato had all the answers, there is no philosophical progress. And so Plato couldn't have been right about that. Ergo, Plato can't be right about everything, right? That's just a syllogism, right? Just follows directly. So anyway, I bring Plato here. He is constantly being amazed by our society and both its good points, what he judges to be good and bad. He's certainly amazed by our science and technology, but he's also amazed at the progress we've made philosophically, ethically, politically. And that is part of my argument, that this process that he started actually has had an effect, that it's partly due to philosophical arguments that Plato is so surprised by what he discovers. So I'm going to start with the Googleplex. Oh, here are the 5 places that 5 dialogues. He first comes here. He is in conversation with his media escort. Very, what is she? She's a very annoying woman, I have to say. Very opinionated, and she has no use for philosophy. She's a very practical woman, and she's actually able to enlighten Plato about certain things that she thinks are intuitively obvious, and that kind of open his eyes about certain ethical truths. And there's also a software engineer named Marcus. And Marcus believes that perhaps we can rig up an ethical answer search engine, acronym EASE, by which we could algorithmically, algorithmically answer ethical questions. And Plato quickly absorbs this idea. He's very, very smart, and he has arguments against it, and from things that he said a long time ago. The next place he goes, Plato, he now has his Chromebook cradled constantly with him, is to the 92nd Street Y, and he's on a panel of child-rearing experts, and the topic is how to raise the exceptional child. And his fellow panelist is a woman named Sophie Z, author of The Warrior's Guide to How to Produce Off-the-Chart Children, national bestseller, and another woman who's psychoanalytically trained in Vienna, and her book is, let me see if I've title of her book. Okay, well, yes, here's the invitation, actually, from the Y. Join us at the Y for what promises to be the highlight of the season. Zachary Burns, beloved columnist for the newspaper of record, will lead a discussion on how to raise an exceptional child. With Zach will be best-selling author Mitzi Munitz, author of Esteeming Your Child, How Even the Best-Intentioned Parents Violate, Mutilate, and Desecrate Their Children. Sophie Z, best-selling author of The Warrior Mother's Guide to Producing Off-the-Chart Children, and Plato, best-selling author of The Republic. And they fight it out there on the stage of the 92nd Street Y. The next thing I do with Plato is I have him giving advice. He's an expert consultant to an advice columnist about love and sex. And Plato has an awful lot to say about love and sex. He devoted 2 magnificent dialogues, actually, to the subject. One is the Symposium, and that's the one from which we derive our slightly degraded idea of Platonic love, and that's from Socrates' speech there about how the erotic longing we direct to beautiful young things, which is our love of beauty, ought to be redirected, sublimated, so that all that love of beauty is directed towards beautiful mathematics and beautiful laws of nature and beautiful laws of justice, and eventually to the idea of beauty itself. And so there he's kind of down on personal romantic love. He's trying to argue us out of it. And in the Phaedrus, which is a dialogue I like even more, Plato shows himself to be really torn about this subject of romantic love. He has Socrates, who is, for the first time in any of the dialogues, outside the city walls. He's walking in this lush countryside, and he lies down beside a beautiful boy, Phaedrus, beside a sparkling stream, and they talk of love. And Socrates' first speech to Phaedrus argues against the madness of love, to be taken over, to be possessed by another person, and to direct all of your erotic energy towards him or her. And then Socrates, as they're about to leave, they're about to step over the stream, and he says, "Wait a minute. I am ashamed. I have offended the god, Eros." And he gives another speech completely reversing himself on the glories of the madness of love. He's in a very strange mood, Plato, when he writes this. This is really out of character for Plato, so much so that many of us, including me, believe he was in love. He was in love when he wrote that, and we even think there's etymological evidence within the ancient Greek pointing to whom he was in love with, and which would actually make sense, the character that we've arrived at. But this is actually one of the reasons I love Plato, because he philosophizes with his whole soul. If, in fact, he's fallen in love and he thinks this is a good thing, he's going to philosophically reverse his ideas about it. Philosophy for Plato is not just a mind, it's not a game, it's not an intellectual game. It's not a way of showing off how smart you are, which often happens in the academy. Of course, he founded the academy, the first academy. He founded the prototype of the European university. But for Plato, it is all about trying to figure out how to live. And so he would reverse himself if he was in love. He would rethink his ideas. In fact, Plato is constantly rethinking his ideas. When we teach Plato and we say, this is what Plato said, theory of forms, division between the mind and the soul and the body, that's quite wrong. Plato himself subjects those views to stringent, rigorous criticism, so much so that, in later dialogues, he actually gives them up. So anyway, he has a lot to say about love and sex. And what I did for that is I am friends with a professional advice columnist. She wrote as, I think for Slate or maybe Salon, as Dear Prudence. And she is the daughter of a very famous advice columnist, Ann Landers, and the niece of a famous advice columnist, Dear Abby. And what I did is I made up questions that I knew Plato would have something to say about because of the Symposium and the Phaedrus. Very, very contemporary questions, like I'm a graduate student in a really hard-hit humanities subject. I'm a graduate student about to get my PhD. There are no jobs. My professor has offered to be my professor with benefits. Should I do it? Should I, he's a man of honor. We're both involved with other people, so there's no danger of getting really involved. Should I do it? And this is something Plato has something to say. A similar situation arises in the Phaedrus. And I sent these various questions, I think there were about 12 of them, to my friend Margot. She gave her answer, and then she consulted Plato. And I give his advice, which is often more liberal than Margot's advice, which was pretty surprising. The next place I bring him, he's on an author's book tour, is to cable news. And he's on a show called The Real McCoy, the bombastic McCoy, his name is Roy McCoy, begins the interview by saying something like, where is that? Roy McCoy. Okay, so they tell me you're a big deal in philosophy, Plato. I'm going to tell you up front, because that's the kind of guy I am up front, that I don't think much of philosophers. Plato, many don't. The term attracts a wide range of reaction, from admiration to amusement to animadversion. Some people think philosophers are worthless, and others that they are worth everything in the world. Sometimes they take on the appearance of statesmen and sometimes of sophists. Sometimes, too, they might give the impression that they're completely insane. This is actually a direct quote. It comes from the sophist. McCoy, well, I'm going to go with that last one. Just as long as you add that it's the kind of insane that makes right-thinking Americans the world over want to smack you upside the head. It continues. It gets into subjects about American democracy, whether or not there can be, in this particular interview, whether or not there can be morality without religion. Has science progressed? Roy McCoy doesn't even think science has progressed, much less philosophy. And one of the things that really happens is that there's so little communication between them. And Plato, when he got his Chromebook, and he saw the amazing discussions that are going on, the discourse, the dialogues that are going on in the internet, is very, very hopeful. And hopes that this means that we're constantly challenging our own points of view by speaking to so many that we don't even have to be face-to-face with. And on this show, The Real McCoy, he becomes more despairing about whether or not these new forms, the chat rooms, the blogs, are actually opening our minds up, or whether we're actually speaking to those who already agree with us, and even getting our news from sources that already agree with us. So he becomes a little more despairing of us, but he still thinks we've made a lot of progress. And the last place I bring him to is to this neuroscience lab. And he's about to have his brain imaged. He's about to undergo an fMRI. And he gets into a discussion with two neuroscientists. One is a postdoc, and one is the head of the laboratory, Dr. Choquette, on whether or not neuroscience has retired many of the questions that philosophers used to lay claim to, free will, personal identity, and in fact, all notions of a person choosing their own life, making choices, decisions, intentions, and standards of rationality, whether it's all determined, and it's determined on the level of our 100 billion neurons firing, or 100 trillion synapses. Plato, by this time, knows a lot of neuroscience, and he has a discussion with these two neuroscientists there. Anyway, so those are the contemporary places that I brought him. There were many other places I actually wanted to bring him. He has a lot of things to say about money and politics mixing together, and the dangers of this. I thought about bringing him to Congress to testify about campaign finance reform. And there were actually a lot of things I could have lifted out of the Republic and the laws. I also thought about having him give a TED Talk. That would probably be a disaster for him. He's actually, as I said, so his mentor, the man he loved so much, Socrates, hung out in the agora, in the marketplace of Athens, buttonholing anybody he could and asking them his very peculiar questions. And, very high up people, statesmen, powerful people, rhetoricians, sophists, who were itinerant professors, sort of. And, but all the way down to slaves. It was a slave society. And Plato, after Socrates' execution, after the Athenians voted that he was guilty of the two charges that were brought against him, impiety and corrupting the young, I have a theory as to why they killed him when they did kill him, Plato left Athens. He might have thought his own life was in danger, but he was certainly demoralized, disillusioned, and he left Athens. He traveled widely, very importantly for the development of his own point of view, as distinct from Socrates. He traveled to Italy, which was a center of the Pythagorean community. So this view that mathematics presents the key to understanding the world, the intelligibility of the world is given to us in mathematics. That had a very important effect on Plato. But when he came back to Athens, he didn't go to the Agora. That had proved to be pretty fatal and futile, he judged. And he founded the academy. He separated himself from the mass of people. He had a very low opinion of most people's potential for being rational, for being able to think through. As you know, he developed the idea of the philosopher king to make most of the decisions for the masses of us. And he did give one public lecture, and this is why I know he would really bomb at TED. It was on the good, and apparently the Athenians flocked to this one public lecture. Here was the famous Plato, founder of their academy, up there on the mountaintop, bringing the jewels of his wisdom down to them. It was called the good. They all thought it was going to give the secret of success, how we can get ahead, because the Athenians were as obsessed with that as we are, how to achieve, how to get ahead, how to bruit your name abroad, how to acquire what they called kleos and what we might call a high clout score. And one of the ways in which we were very close to them. And they flocked to this, and Plato gave this talk on the good, which was mostly mathematics, in a way to convince them that they perhaps, that they really had no business even going here, that they were not capable of understanding this. So I think he would not do very well at TED. But if he did want to do well at TED, he should definitely start with the death of Socrates and how moving that was, and how that really tore him to pieces and influenced the rest of his life. So I know, if he has any savviness, which I don't think he did, have that kind of savviness, that's the way he should begin. But he would probably make it all mathematics. Anyway, that is what I do at bringing Plato into the modern world. And I thought I might read just a little bit of Plato, at Google. Let's see. So I'm going to just start in the middle. There's already been quite a lot of discussion here. The only thing, let's say Plato has brought up the idea of ethical expertise, that one needs a kind of expertise to be able to answer ethical questions. And he's used the metaphor of, if you have crooked teeth, this is a metaphor that suggests himself because Marcus has quite crooked teeth. And so if you have crooked teeth, you go to the expert who can straighten out your teeth, right? You go to the orthodontist, and Cheryl has somebody to recommend in town in San Francisco who did her children's teeth. And similarly with ethical questions, that there's a kind of expertise, and we go to, one ought to go to the experts who are the philosophers. The only other thing, I guess, that it needs to be known is he's also, Cheryl makes an allusion to the Charlie Sheen level of ass dumbness. And Plato picks that up right away. Charlie Sheen being an actor who behaved very stupidly, right? So Plato picks that up very quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit. Oh, Cheryl, the media escort, is recounting this episode, taking Plato around to her friend. So they're in a bar in San Francisco, and she's telling her friend about this. Plato's dialogues sometimes are written like real plays, with, Socrates saying that, you have the characters listed, but sometimes it's one person recounting the story. And here it's Cheryl recounting the story. Okay, I'm just going to read a little bit. Oh, and I ought to mention that right around now there was a little commotion because 2 Googlers had shown up to take my author on his tour. And I could see that he was really torn. He was involved in the kind of conversation that you could see he just lives for. I mean, you could see it was his life's blood. But he was also eager to get an insider's look at Google. The whole cloud idea had caught his fancy for some reason. Before, I had wanted him to skip the tour since I thought it would be exhausting for him. But then the kind of conversation he was intent on having was every bit as exhausting, at least for me. He asked me if it would be possible to take the tour after he gave his authors at Google talk. No, I told him, that's out of the question, since that's when you're signing the books. Right. He was all for skipping the book signing, but obviously that wasn't going to happen on my watch. When it comes to that sort of thing, then I'm the one who has to be the tyrant, since I answer to the publishers, and believe me, they keep track of how their authors do with the various media escorts, comparing our sales records with one another. Marcus tipped the balance by telling Plato again that not only did he want to challenge his view, but he could also explain the way that Google works, the way the search engine is able to deliver the right information to people with such accuracy. You're not going to get that on the tour of the Googleplex, he told Plato, since the answers you're looking for lie in the sphere of abstraction, which of course is right up your alley. With that, Plato was so happy that he actually allowed himself a real smile, not just the hint of one, and I sent the tour guides, who seemed genuinely disappointed, on their way. Apparently, they were big fans of Plato's too. Go figure. Plato got right down to business, asking Marcus what were the points he wanted to challenge. Okay, let me just reiterate the major points that have emerged so far, at least as I see them, Marcus said. You assume that if there's knowledge, especially if it's non-trivial knowledge, that's difficult to come by, then those who have the knowledge are the few, the experts in that knowledge. Is that right? Yes, Plato said. That this is so seems to me almost a tautology. We shall see, said Marcus. Okay, then you also assume that there is such a thing as knowledge about how we ought to live our lives, that it's not just a matter of personal preference or cultural norms, say, and that this knowledge is non-trivial and hard to come by. Am I right? Yes, Plato said, it must certainly be non-trivial, since so many people get it wrong, living lives that are almost at a Charlie Sheen level of ass-dumbness. He didn't, I said to Cheryl. He did, repeated me word for word. Even Marcus had an all-out laugh instead of snicker. Okay, then, Marcus went on. So then the implication of these 2 assumptions is that if anybody has this knowledge, and I suppose it's consistent with your 2 assumptions that nobody has it, but if, in fact, anyone has this knowledge, it can only belong to those who have managed to think their way to it. Am I right? Yes, said Plato. So according to you, this knowledge is something like mathematical knowledge. It's just as objective, its truth not determined by personal preferences or societal norms, and it's just as non-trivial and difficult to access, being a matter of reasoning. Yes, said Plato, I agree to all of this. In fact, I would go further and claim that it is not only like mathematical reasoning, but that mathematics itself goes into the knowledge. Okay, Marcus said, but let's just stick with the weaker proposition for the purposes of my refuting you. Yes, agreed Plato, that makes dialectical sense. Okay, Marcus said, and then took several moments to breathe. He was, as my mother used to put it, overexcited. Okay, he said again, what all of this implies, as Cheryl was quick to point out, is that only those who are gifted in reasoning can discover how we ought to live. There's no other way to access these truths, meaning that non-philosophical people who can't follow philosophical arguments have to accept the conclusions from the philosophers. Yes, said Plato. Hence the enormous obligations to others that philosophers have, including, said Marcus, obligations to tell others how they should be living, to legislate morals for them. No, said Plato, not in every respect. No, since, as was also pointed out by Cheryl, there are many matters that lie entirely in the sphere of personal or cultural preferences. And many such decisions, which are therefore entirely a matter for an individual to decide for himself or herself, he's already been corrected about his sexist language, so he overcorrects and it's all himself or herself. Cheryl had corrected him on this. So for an individual to decide for himself or herself, or to let society decide for him or her, will help to make for a life worth living. So that, for example, if I am of such a nature that I need to test my manhood, I hope it's not sexist to mention manhood in this context, he asked, looking at me. Cheryl said, why don't you just say test your courage? Women test their courage too. Yes, you're right, he agreed. If I say I am of such a nature that I need to test my courage by taking repeated risks, then I am free to do so insofar as the risks I take do not involve any moral transgressions. A great deal of the substance of a life worth living is made up of decisions of this sort. But not all of them, Marcus prodded. No, not all of them, Plato agreed. And these are the contributions to a life worth living that a philosophically unintelligent person can't decide for themselves, but must instead turn the decision over to the philosophically intelligent, Marcus said. Not quite, said Plato. Nobody, the philosophically intelligent any more than the philosophically non-intelligent, can decide these matters for himself or herself, since there are objective facts of the matter. Those who can access such knowledge are no more able to change the facts of how we are to live than anybody else. Like everybody else, they must abide by them. The one difference is that they are able to discover through the special talents and training that are theirs what the facts are. So they are not imposing their personal will on others any more than mathematicians are imposing their wills on others by informing non-mathematicians what the mathematical truths are. They are simply sharing their knowledge with others, knowledge that others cannot access for themselves, lacking the requisite cognitive skills, a matter both of talent and training. This seems to me no more unfair than that the mathematically intelligent share their knowledge of mathematics with the mathematically unintelligent. So, for example, you, as a software engineer, possess considerable mathematical intelligence, I would assume. Yes, Marcus said, I suppose you could say that. And by working here at Google, Plato said, you are able to provide the benefits of your mathematical intelligence to others who are lacking this kind of intelligence, who make use of your powerful search engine while simply regarding it as techno-magic. The difference, Marco said, is that not everybody believes himself to be good in math or even cares to be. In fact, only those who are in fact good in math give a hoot about whether they're good at it or not. But everybody cares about living his life well and has strong views about how best to do it. And if you tell him that he's just lacking the cognitive ability to figure it all out for himself, he's going to have some harsh words for you. I'm going to stop here because one thing I think Plato got very right is that discourse, dialogue, conversation, give and take, Q&A is essential. So I'm going to stop here. Maybe you can anticipate what Marcus's objection to what Plato just said would be, and maybe you can even anticipate what Plato would say in answer to Marcus. Marcus basically is trying to take down the idea of ethical experts, philosophical experts. Yeah, I'm going to stop here and ask for your questions. Thank you.
My only question is, am I expected to have read Plato before I can enjoy this book?
I do, I do quote from him or reference him, and it's surprising how often what he has to say is actually relevant to conversations that we are having that are very current in our society. But no, of course not, you don't have to. Although I am getting emails from people saying that they've opened up their Plato books, that haven't been opened since they were freshmen in college. I'll tell you something. I think so much of Plato is really terrifically boring, and he's raising these questions for the first time, and that's magnificent. That's amazing. And philosophy is divided into all these subspecialties. You know, for just about any area of human inquiry or concern, there's a corresponding area of philosophy. So philosophy of language, philosophy of science, which is my own particular interest, philosophy of mathematics, also quite interested in that, philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, philosophy of art, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of knowledge itself, epistemology. I'm leaving things out, but and now applied ethics as well. So applied ethics is applied to the environment, to medical ethics, to minority concerns. So for every area, there's a corresponding area of philosophy. What's amazing is Plato actually carved out that entire terrain. He really asked the paradigmatic questions in philosophy of mathematics, in philosophy of language, in philosophy of religion, epistemology, certainly ethics, but that he had gotten from Socrates, that concern with ethics, and perhaps to some extent political philosophy he had gotten from Socrates, but he asked these questions. And what else is so interesting, philosophical questions are very peculiar. A lot of the questions that were first asked by philosophers were proto-scientific questions. As science progressed, they were taken out of the domain of philosophy. The empirical methodology caught up, and they were answered, right? So all of physics and cosmology started in the domain of philosophy. It was called natural philosophy, and it really pretty much remained as philosophy until 16th, 17th century, when the scientific method really, this beautiful marriage of empiricism and mathematical description, that part Plato got right, were brought together, and we really started making headway and overturned the Aristotelian Ptolemaic system that had dominated in science until the reemergence of science, or real science, I would say, with Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo. By the way, Kepler and Galileo, who so valued mathematical description, always refer to Plato as the divine Plato. And if you read the Timaeus, you understand why. Because that notion that it's math, he's pretty much given up on the theory of forms by the Timaeus, that it's math. It's in fact, the most beautiful math. So if we have two theories and they're both adequate to explain what we're observing, go with the mathematically beautiful one, and you'll go toward the truth. Kepler, Copernicus, that's what they were saying. In fact, Galileo had said he wouldn't even have bothered with experiment because the beautiful math was enough if his critics weren't so stupid, so that he had to actually demonstrate to them with experiments. So this kind of notion of the beautiful math leading the way, this is Plato. But in any case, a lot of scientific questions first belonged to philosophy, and then the empirical methodology catches up. Psychology, same thing. Linguistics, logic, right, which belong to the sphere of philosophy. Now, it takes place in mathematics departments. So as science progresses, it is true that the set of philosophical questions somewhat shrinks. But I actually think that there's a conservation because of philosophical questions, because science itself presents so many philosophical questions to us, trying to make sense of the science, which is why philosophers always have to keep up with science. But why am I saying all of this in answer to you? Because I didn't say it before, and I think it's important. But no, you don't have to know. You don't have to know Plato. As much as I can, I bring him in. I know why I was saying it to you, because what philosophers are often, we're often defending ourselves, especially if you're a philosopher like me who hangs out mostly with scientists. We're often defending ourselves against the charge that look, the history of philosophy is the history of contraction. As science expands, philosophy, shrinks, contracts. Here's an equation, the theta philosophy equation. As t goes toward infinity, the set of philosophical questions goes towards the null set, right? I mean, that, in fact, eventually science will answer all of these questions. I think that's wrong, actually. And Plato, this is the extraordinary thing. Plato, even though he really lived before there was any real science to speak of, has some of the best anti-reductive arguments against that kind of reduction of all philosophical questions to scientific ones. The other place where you often hear this is not science, that philosophy has no right to exist, but religion. And that used to be an argument you would get much more often in the bad old days. But you still get it, actually. And Plato also has, in the Euthyphro, the best argument against those who would reduce philosophical questions, in particular ethical questions, or why is there something rather than nothing, to religious questions, but particularly moral questions. He has an incredible argument, which is still repeated even into our day by the so-called new atheists, as to why religion could never ground morality. And so he has these two very prescient arguments, on the one side against scientific reductionism, and on the other side against sort of theological reductionism. And that's really all you have to know about Plato, I think. That is the most interesting thing about him. He had such a nose for this peculiar kind of philosophical question that not only did he raise this submerged continent of philosophical questions, he had the prescience to see that some of these questions would never be answered either by religion or by science, but yet could be answered through human reason. Or we could make progress with them through human reason, and an ongoing process. So I think that's all the most important thing to know about Plato, and not to have to wade through so much that's not terribly interesting to us anymore.
I'm actually interested in the relationship between Plato and what he might think of modern technology. And specifically, for example, what would he think about our extreme preoccupation with Facebook and Google? Like, would that, for example, make us sink deeper into the cave or allow us to leave the cave?
Yes. Actually, yes. This thing that I have in the New York Times, the stone, is exactly about this, right? It's exactly about what would Plato tweet? I had never tweeted, and I'm not on Facebook. I had never been interested. But my daughter, who's much more savvy than I am, suggested to me, how would you like to tweet as Plato? And I have been tweeting as Plato for like the past, 3 weeks or something. And the handle is Plato Book Tour. So Plato is with us now. I often have him tweeting about the events that I've gone on. And I was just with a writer last night, and he said to me, do you lie in bed afterwards thinking, this is how I should have answered the question? And I said, well, of course I do, right? I mean, it's always very hard to give an adequate answer up front. But now I could have Plato saying, regarding capital punishment question at Harvard Bookstore, Goldstein flubbed it. Here's what I'd say, right? So this is just wonderful for me because I can actually answer them much better, what Plato would have to say. Plato, I think, would be quite struck by the way in which we're trying to answer the questions of how to live a life that matters, and that we're all preoccupied with that question. For a very long time, religion answered that for us, right? We mattered in the universe in a very large way. God, we mattered to God. God was keeping track of everything we did. I was brought up very, very religious, and I believed as a little girl that if I took a nibble from a Hostess Twinkie bar, which did not have the right rabbinical symbol on it, that the Lord of the hosts would take note and, and punish me. I had to do my repentance, which was terrifying, but it certainly gave one a sense that you really mattered, right? Every single thing you did mattered. For many of us, that kind of confirmation of our mattering coming from that kind of worldview no longer resonates. And so this question that actually was there in Plato's society, his society was pre-monotheistic. We are more and more post-monotheistic. And we're going toward the same kind of answer, which is we want a lot of people to know of us. We want everything. If God's not watching, we want as many Twitter followers as possible. We broadcast everything. You're in a restaurant, people are taking pictures of their food, right, to put on Facebook. That sense of giving our life a moreness, using our social media, now that Jehovah's no longer watching, is very similar to what the Greeks, the ancient Greek society, especially Athens, was about. And it was against that Socrates was arguing in the Agora. That's what he was saying. When he says the unexamined life is not worth living, which Plato has him saying in the Apology, which was Plato's version of Socrates' trial, which did not end well for Socrates, when he's saying that, he is antagonizing the Athenians so that his execution is almost a foregone conclusion, because they were so concerned with feeling that they mattered and believing that their high achievements, and for those who couldn't achieve, just being an Athenian, being a member of that exceptional society. If there was Athenian exceptionalism, it's American exceptionalism, to just be a member of that society would do it for you. You mattered. But they had this notion of kleos, which meant to claim and to do something. Be an Olympic victor, be a great warrior, be smart, be a good philosopher, be a sophist, be very rich, be beautiful. They worship beauty, right? Because anything that would blow your life up so that many people would be paying attention satisfied their notion of mattering. Because you certainly didn't look to the Greek gods for your affirmation of existence. The last thing you wanted was the attention of the Greek gods. Something terrible always happened if they paid attention to you, at the very least a rape, or worse, right? And so you didn't look there, you looked to your fellow citizens and you tried to do something big. This obviously promoted a society of extraordinary, explosive ambition and achievement, also havoc, right? But Plato and Socrates before him thought that it's shallow. That's not what's going to do it. So Plato is struck by similarities and the way we're falling back on social media to fill the vacuum that monotheism has left, to create a society that's very much like the one that forced philosophy in the first place, which is why he thinks that our society is ripe for, again, recognizing the value of philosophy. That's what he thinks. I sort of think so too. Yes.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Oh,
so we need to wrap up, but she'll be here for a few more minutes for those of you who'd like to come on up and chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.